Welcome, everyone. We're excited to launch today our third panel of our Victims of Crime Week, where the theme that we're talking about is collaboration and working together. And this whole week has been about looking at the intersection of sexual harm and restorative and transformative justice. So we're really excited for this panel. I'm excited to be amongst some of my beloved humans and to have what I think is a really important conversation. So I wanted to start by just acknowledging the land that I'm joining from, which is the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh, and to also do the extra important parts of connecting why we acknowledge the land with the topic that we're talking about today. I think it's most important to highlight that today is about speaking truth. Truth that sometimes is not always the stuff that we want to talk about, but what colonialism has taught us is that we need to speak truth to things in order to reconcile them, to do repair work, to continue to challenge ourselves to show up in good ways. And on top of that, that sexual harm is part of the colonial project that allowed these lands to be stolen and continue to disproportionately affect Indigenous folks across Turtle Island. So we are grateful to the stewards and to the teachers that have brought many of the teachings that we're talking about today, and to acknowledge that restorative and transformative ways of thinking about justice have lived on these lands since the beginning of time. So today we're talking nuance, we're talking unintended consequences, and we're talking about possibility, because that is, of course, where we want to be thinking about new and emerging things, which I think you'll hear from our panel today. I am going to do quick framing around why I thought this panel would be really important and why the team brought this one together. And that was because one of our colleagues in the anti-violence sector said something to me that really resonated and stayed with me, which was how in this kind of season or era where RJ specifically is being really turned to as kind of quote unquote an alternative to the criminal legal system for survivors of sexual assault, do we not fall in a trap where there might be co-optation to think about decriminalizing sexual violence? And it was that particular piece that stuck with me. But I think if we kind of pan out and fly above that, we can start to think about perhaps more unintended consequences of perhaps pedestalizing an alternative when we feel so disillusioned with the current system. And so that's what I hope we can get into today. I'm going to pass it over to Son Min, who's going to be our facilitator for this conversation. And I just want to remind us all that these conversations in public take a lot of vulnerability. And so we ask for grace and, as Tyler said, to practice being able to change our minds, knowing that this is a snapshot in time and that we are thinking out loud together. And so this is not a position, this is not a stance necessarily. It might just be how we're processing and thinking today. So San Min, I will pass it over to you.
Thanks, Dahlia. We are in thought together, I think is what Dahlia said. I love that your framing also just indicates that we've already been in conversation before we're about to go in conversation. So that checks out, I think, for this particular panel. And yeah, just really happy to be here and to be able to facilitate this conversation. And I think we'll just start off by asking everyone to just briefly introduce themselves and share a little bit about your relationship to Salal as well as this topic. And you can talk about just restorative justice and transformative justice approaches to sexual violence, or even broadly about kind of what we're talking about is unintended consequences, if you want to talk about kind of your relationship to that particular topic. But I'm happy to start just a little bit as a facilitator. So I'm Sanmin, pronouns are she, her, they, them, and I'm a first generation Korean queer person living on the unceded territories of the Kakite peoples, colonially known as New Westminster. And I have had a very long-term relationship with Salal. Not as long as Felix or Dahlia, but I come pretty up there as far as my relationship with Salal. But I started as a volunteer on the crisis line with Salal Sexual Violence Support Center back in 2014. And so going on 12 years. Yes, all my serious relationships are long-term relationships. Um, and I had the privilege to, I think, be part of Salal's really like early conversations around alternative approaches to sexual violence. I think especially on the heels of the organization changing its mandate to serve gender diverse and trans survivors. And I think since then also, I have been, I have remained connected and really invested in the topic. And when I went on to work in the City of Vancouver's Equity Office, there was an opportunity to think about actually creating a program as a way of dealing with workplace conflicts outside of investigations. And so that's also where I got to work closely with JJ. I won't spoil their bio, so I will pause there, but um, there will be a fourth panel member just walking around here and there, so I hope it's not just too distracting. But yeah, maybe I will pass over to Felix.
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Felix, they, them. I'm honored to get to do my work here on the territories of the Pentlatch, Aitsin, Saplut, and Sitzitla people, place that is colonially known as Courtney, BC. So I'm a small town queer. I'm also a Vancouver escapee. So I'm a recent small town queer. Yeah, I moved here from Vancouver about a year and a half ago. And I also have a long history with Salal, as Sanmin mentioned. So yeah, I think, oh gosh, I also started out at Salal as a volunteer just a little bit, a couple of years before you did, Sanmin. I think I was back in 2011, 2012, something around there. And I also, it was an incredible honor and privilege that I had to be with Salal kind of through those transition years of working towards better inclusion for queer and trans people. Got to do a lot of the work around that, which, as you said, kind of bled into the TJ RJ work. I always share this anecdote when I'm talking about the history of Salal and RJ, where Sanmin and I were at this RJ conference in Banff one year. This is when we were like in the early days of like, are we going to do this or not? And we were trying to kind of muster up our courage to take the plunge into doing it. She's laughing already because she knows what I'm going to say. And so Sanmin and I had been at this like pre kind of training, and it was just dawning on us that we were biting off quite a lot, and we were kind of terrified to do it. And so Sanmin and I were walking around this beautiful trail outside the conference after, kind of stressing out, like having a little bit of a moment. And I said, Sanmin, we need to ground. And so I crawled into a dry riverbed to find a rock to ground myself with. Sanmin could not be convinced to get into the dirty dry riverbed with me. But I got into the riverbed and I held up this beautiful, I just picked up a rock and I was like, we're going to put our intentions into this rock and we're going to ground ourselves in the knowledge that we have and our feminist shoulders that we're standing on. And I often come back to that in these kind of brave conversations that we're trying to have. These days I wear a lot of hats. One of them is working in restorative justice here in Courtney. One is working with men who are trying to make changes in their lives and show up in their relationships better. I'm also a grad student studying conflict management, a lot of things that require courage. And so I often think back to Salal and kind of those shoulders that we're standing on of generations of feminists. And I still have that rock. I use it as a talking piece when we do dialogue circles here in Courtney. And I often think of you some, man. So anyways, I'll stop talking. It's a pleasure to be here and to have great conversations with all of you.
Maybe we can go to you, Tyler.
Sure. Thanks, y'all. I'm Tyler Red Sky. I use they, them pronouns. I am a settler. My ancestors on my mom's side come from Ireland. On my dad's side, come from Sicily, Malta, the Maghreb, the Aegean Islands, parts of the Levant. And I'm queer and trans. I come to this work specifically as someone, growing up houseless as a trans youth. We like TJ was an ethic because it was a safety reality. Like you didn't call the cops because you weren't safe from the police, which I mentioned previously. I didn't really come to RJ. Actually, I didn't share this at the other speaking point, but I went through my own loosely community accountability process and it went really badly. And I think that it speaks often to what can go wrong in TJ. And so I started studying, what else is out there, what could be possible, what would I have needed, what would actually have helped other people that I harmed. And I kind of came into RJ through that. And I was like, oh, people do this. And then I started working at a youth-led diversion program in Wabanaki territory, which is where I moved from. And a good friend of mine, a comrade who I collaborate often with, is Leo Hilton, who introduced me to Marley Lees, who runs Survivors for Justice Reform. And Marley heard that I was moving out to the West Coast here and said, you have to meet Dahlia. And so Marley connected us, I remember, through the work, and you told me about the TJ pilot project. And it was just kind of, even before my work permit came in and I started serving as the executive director of Restorative Justice Victoria, it was really hopeful for me to see, that where I came from too, in Maine specifically, the licensing body, an organization, the sexual violence organization, actually stopped RJ from happening for sexual harm. Like we had been doing it even with youth. I'd held several processes and they basically took it to the Department of Corrections and made them write into our contracts that we could no longer do sexual violence cases. It prohibited us from doing any of that work. So that's kind of my trajectory, long form of getting here. And then Salal was a really amazing collaborator, continues to be a really amazing collaborator, and part of my personal community too. JJ, pass it to you.
Thanks, folks. Yeah, my name is JJ, born and now living on Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh territory. I guess I would say, try to do this really quick. For me growing up, I grew up in a bit of a tough situation and I was really angry all the time. And I didn't know that. And I caused a lot of hurt to the people around me. I just felt like I was always making people upset or hurting people without understanding why. And then a kind of formative part of my journey was becoming part of a religious community and a leader in those spaces. And that was a place that had this ethic of forgiveness above all else, which had like a dark underbelly, but also like a really beautiful focus on love and redemption that informed a lot of who I am. Then I moved through coming out as queer, as trans, coming into queer and more justice-oriented spaces that were dealing with harm in different ways. Communities that I wanted to be really liberatory, but were often just sites of repeating trauma upon each other. And then I came to Salal in 2020 as a volunteer. And from there, was working on the crisis line. And then I was trained as a counselor and moved into the sexual assault counseling role at Salal for trans survivors. Spent some time doing that. And then moved into the transformative justice project lead position. And that felt like a place where I could really bring together a lot of my values and things I'd been percolating on for many years, which is like, how do we respond to harm better? Yeah, from there, I had the chance to do kind of alternative justice work in a large organization, like in a workplace context that was often focused on identity-based harm, and lots of big lessons there as well. And now we're here. And yeah, there's other pieces I'm totally forgetting, but I will leave it there. That's me for now.
I'm sure lots of other pieces will come through this conversation from all of you. And I'm already like, there's so much to dig into, even just what you said in your intros. But I think trusting that people who are listening to these panels are already interested and maybe have some even baseline knowledge about our restorative justice and transformative justice, and that this will inspire them to look into it more. But I think just to kind of level set the conversation, I think can I ask one of you to speak to maybe some of the similarities and differences between these two approaches, and like why do those similarities and differences matter for this conversation? Just very briefly, and if one of you have something to add, obviously you're welcome to, but don't feel like every question all three of you are expected to answer. So anyone who'd like to start, just a little bit, yeah. Who wants to be brave?
I would love to invite a collaborative answer, Felix. Do you want to go
Great.
first?
Great. You
No.
two unmuted at the
Yeah.
same time.
No, you muted first. I'll start and then I'll leave off a cliffhanger that you have to finish. Yeah, I spoke to this a little bit. It's interesting because I think that actually I'm not interested in like too much of defining. Like I think that it can kind of get semantical, but I do think for me there's a distinction. I kind of think about it as I'm going to mess it up, which is funny. Like it's a square rectangle. Like both are squares, but only one is also a rectangle. And in the sense that restorative justice is a way that often we deal with harm relationally. So that's the similarity, right? Like these are about restoring relationships, asking what was the harm done versus what was a law or rule broken, and then what would you have needed to do something differently. And transformational justice asks those same questions, but it also takes a meta lens to look at systems change, and specifically is an abolitionist project in its intention, in the way in which it was like actually started. It was meant to work outside of systems for people who are primarily unsafe in those systems, led by queer and trans, mostly people of color, street involved, sex workers, drug users, to create justice for us, by us, and to look at the larger project of abolition. And I like to say that, you know, we can use TJ values to hold RJ accountable, but that you can't do TJ, for instance, in places where you are a mandated reporter, like schools, or when you take government funding. So yeah, I'll use that distinction and then.
Yeah. Is there a cliffhanger, Felix?
I mean, you said it beautifully, Tyler. Yeah, I think I would just add, I feel very similarly about the distinction between the two of them. I sometimes frame it that TJ is very aspirational, and that is both a good thing and sometimes a challenge. So I think TJ, like similar to what you said, Tyler, like kind of brings us past what RJ is able to do into more abolitionist thinking. And when I say aspirational, I also mean less resourced a lot of the time. So of course, being held in community, you know, there's these beautiful possibilities if we can really think outside of systems. And, you know, we're talking about communities that are impacted by harm, trying to respond to harm. You know, we're talking about generally folks who are living with marginalization, who are living with systemic traumas, and trying to respond to really complicated and nuanced harms, as I'm sure we're going to get into. And so it's this beautiful dream. And sometimes, you know, it can be a decision-making point of which approach, like RJ versus TJ, is better. Because if we're needing something that is like resourced, and it's like someone's job to sit here and do this and hold space for it, sometimes RJ is the way to go. If what we're really after is systemic change that's probably not going to feel like it's got a bow tied on it at the end, is probably going to raise more questions than it gives answers, and is like has this incredible, beautiful community potential, that's a time for project. So I do think that the distinction is important. And as I'm sure we're going to get into, it's not as simple, like it's not one is better than the other. It's really about what is the right fit for the right thing.
Nice. We got a thumb up from JJ. So we'll keep going. But yeah, I think I, yeah, I have lots of thoughts also percolating in the background as you say that. But I appreciated just both of you saying we don't need to, if we try to unpack these like almost what can sometimes feel like theoretical differences, we can get almost too semantic. So I think in this conversation, also my role as a moderator is to also ask, like, can we get more concrete? Can we break it down more so that we get as tangible and concrete in what we're talking about as possible? So, yeah, just wanted to kind of say that also if I'm like asking you more follow-up questions, that's why I want us to get you know, as grounded in real examples as possible. But I think before unpacking kind of the nuances of RJ, TJ approaches to sexual violence, I actually think this question might help us also get to the unintended consequences, which is to really kind of, share with the listeners about and, based on what you have seen, why a survivor may want to pursue justice and accountability outside of the criminal justice system. Like, what are some things that you have heard? What might motivate a survivor or interest them in pursuing and exploring something like that? I think that might help us also talk about some of the unintended consequences of these approaches. Yeah, anyone want to offer something as a starting point? Could be Dahlia too. I know she doesn't want to be part of the panel, but yeah, what do you think?
I mean, there's so many, so I'll just like start us off. And I don't know. I just think like a lot of people don't want any involvement with the criminal legal system. Like there's just like this massive structure um, that is often like opaque and terrifying, and at the end of the day, like so rarely meets the actual like emotional, social, and relational needs that people have after experiencing sexual harm. Like, yeah, that's like a big one off the top.
Yeah, thanks, JJ. I'd love to build on that. We started this panel. Dahlia was sharing this sort of anecdote about this concern about sexual violence being decriminalized. And my thought to that is, I mean, we're going to get into this, but I deeply believe that sexual violence needs to be taken seriously on a structural level. And I think we need to be pretty real about the degree to which it's criminalized now. I mean, when we know that the rates of like actual consequences through the criminal justice system for sexual violence are so abysmally low. It makes a lot of sense to me why somebody might not want to pursue that. I think we can ask real questions about the degree to which sexual violence is criminalized under the current kind of status quo. So to me, it's sometimes the question is, folks might explore an alternative to criminal justice because criminal justice just doesn't really feel like an option. Like I think increasingly since Me Too, people are much more aware that reporting sexual violence often doesn't lead to much. And then the other thing I'll add to, I worked on the crisis line at Salal as a volunteer for a while, and this has also kind of come full circle for me now that I'm working on the flip side of anti-violence a bit with men who have caused harm. A lot of the times, the folks who hurt us are people we love. People aren't monsters. People cause harm who aren't like terrible people who we just want to like toss out and get rid of. This is certainly isn't all the time. I think a lot of survivors are navigating intense rage and anger that is righteous, and we want to hold space for that and allow it. And it coexists with love and care a lot of the time. And so that to me says, we want a solution that feels more wholesome than just lock them up and throw away the key. And that is a really delicate thing to navigate that I think, whether we're calling it RJ or TJ or somewhere in between, I think kind of holds the potential to hold the the full nuance and reality of how harm is happening. Like we know that the majority of the time sexual violence is caused by a partner, an intimate partner, or a family member, someone who we probably have really complicated relationships with. And, we need to bring a complicated and nuanced response to that as well.
Yeah, I building off of what both y'all said, so many thoughts. I feel like, yeah, one of the main things, right, is that in terms of survivors, every RJ program I've worked with or connected to, like all of our evaluations or success rates, both from the person who caused the harm and the person who experienced the harm or the survivor, are in the high 90s, right? And then if you look at any evaluations of like people who have any contact with the criminal legal system, that's starkly not the reality. Both processes, RJ or TJ, allow a responsive approach that continues to center the needs of all those that were impacted, right? And I think that that's when we're allowed to get creative. For instance, I worked on this was a really serious case. It was a historical childhood sexual assault between family members. And I was able to, for the person who caused harm, they were within a family system, talk to every single member of that family, including grandparents, parents, siblings, spouses of siblings, right? And that was the way to kind of disrupt the ecosystem that allowed not only that harm to happen when these two were children, but also the current, JJ, what you spoke to is this like forgiveness, right? Like you just forgive it, get on, which continue to erode the survivor's reality and the impact that that person was carrying. And the criminal legal system would never be able to approach that harm in that way. And without having that confrontation, even with, right, this was a case that was referred to by Crown. So even with the Crown laying charges, this family was still in denial that it had happened. And so I had to repeatedly meet with members of the family and be like, this happened. And even the person who caused harm says they did it. And that person was with me in the phone call saying, I did do it. And the denial, the culture of denial was so strong in that family system that it took an outside person disrupting that. And I think that, again, right, the criminal legal system is not built, it is not its intention. And I think for me, it gets into this concept of, Felix, what you said really beautifully. I, as a survivor myself and who's someone who's caused harm, like I deeply want us to take these things seriously. I want harm and the impact of harm to be acknowledged in its fullness without like denial or diffusion or deflection or blaming, and healing. And what would it take for us to uncouple that from this identity of criminal, right? And what else does that like criminalization and the idea of criminal, right, which brings up to me like super predator and the construct of those identities. And as someone who's trans, all of us, right, on this like that, we're deviant, right? And so when we look at deviance, and I at least in the nonprofit world have had people say things that are racist and transphobic and that fit within that concept of criminal constantly, right? I am always suspect in those spaces because I wasn't really meant to exist in those spaces. And so I think about like, how do we, yeah, focus on the harm and the healing without going to the same system that caused the original harm to try to fix it or reconstitute it. And I'm curious about that conversation, because that to me is why I've seen a lot of survivors pull back, is because they're like, the point isn't the punishment, the point is the amendment, right? Like the change, the shift, the accountability, and the safety. And the safety of like the people that were harmed is not the priority of the state.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, that makes me think about also why it's so essential that we talk about sexual violence as a systemic harm. I think it's so common before you've spent time in this world to think like, oh, a sexual harm is happening, something happens between two people, and it's an individual issue, it's an interpersonal issue. But I think for those of us that have spent time here and seeing the connections between sexual violence and colonialism, sexual violence and misogyny, sexual violence and patriarchy and racism and all these, like, it is so much bigger. And that's where you see those reverberations into family systems, into communities, the different kinds of attitudes and fears that hold up sexual violence, that keep it a secret, that keep it in denial. And then when you look at the criminal legal system, and I think about this with a couple of like big high profile cases in the last little bit, like the criminal legal system is trying to like ascertain and determine if something really specific happened. And I'm not a legal scholar, so I'm going to butcher this, but just like, and if it happened beyond a certain level of doubt, and if it can set a certain level of legal precedent, and if it meets all these criteria, it just is trying to do something, one very like specific thing, which I think is important, and we could talk about like criminalization and what that means, but it is not like addressing the harm that happened. It's um they're just different sets of needs. Yeah.
I think also one thing that really struck me, Felix, when you described working with men who have caused harm as like working on the flip side of the anti-violence movement, or and I think I was just kind of like, yeah, but this is exactly what we are also trying to disrupt, is that this is not the flip side of what we're trying to achieve. And so I was just like cheeky. And also I was like, actually, we're saying that part of really the interest and like almost motivation behind these alternative approaches is that we cannot treat that work as the flip side of this work, right? So, yeah, just really thinking about, I think, alongside also what both of you have said is like, but that need of actually, I think, disrupting denial and for people to even just barely start to step into accountability. It's just like that need is so strong, and yet that need is not being met in the criminal legal system, right? So I just want to, I think we are already kind of getting to like, oh, Dahlia, yes, yes, yes.
Just very, very briefly, I just want to say thank you for that answer. I think it's like so important. And I think what is resonating with me so much that I just want to say is like scarcity is at the heart, for me, anyways, of so much of what capitalism and colonization has brought here that we live with. And I think we underestimate how much concepts and feeling of scarcity impact our ability to be visionary and to be accountable to each other and to think about all of the myriad of ways um, that impacts like our ability to provide survivors with more options, our ability to see this as like more complex, to see that supporting men to do better is an important part of the anti-violence movement. Like, whether it's that we're fighting for funding or that we're fighting for space or our feelings, like for me, it's just, I really heard that so much in everything you were saying.
Mhm. Yeah, I think also, oh, yes, Tyler, go for it.
Well, were you going to speak directly? Because I just had that thread to pull in because I would love to hear what everyone had to say on this. So, were you? I didn't want to overspeak. Okay. There's this book, Insurgent Love by Ardeth Weinchat, which is one of my favorite, most important seminal texts that looks at domestic homicide. And one of the things that really kind of stood out to me, many things stand out to me in that book as a practitioner, but two, the nuance in which he tries to unpack violence, right, between like power, control, and coercion and situational violence. But two, Dolly, what you were saying, which is she really grounded into, I think this concept of scarcity is deeply embedded in the construction of, and I don't think any of us want this, but I think it's an inheritance that we have as settlers in the idea of settler. And she talks about that there was like in the same way that the construction of a nation, so-called nation state was created, so was the concept of settler, because they were worried when colonization was first happening that people would become content and they would become homesteaders. And what's the difference between someone who's satiated versus like this extractive mentality that continues to never be satiated, that roots in this relationship both to land and to like people, right? And this is like, I think why, if we only look at gender as like the root of sexual violence, and we don't look at like that, for instance, intimate partner homicide rates are much higher in places where colonization has occurred or like originated. And also the intimate partner homicide rates are similarly high in queer and trans relationships, right? Which doesn't really speak to the gender-based violence piece necessarily. So I think that it's this concept, right, of the scarcity of what happens when you create an entire identity that can never feel like at peace and is constantly like going out and externalizing and extracting both in terms of land and relationship. Then we create this like incredibly violent society that I think is really like something that the criminal legal system obviously is not positioned to address.
Yeah, I think what I was gonna add actually kind of on what Dahlia mentioned, I think one of the questions that we were also thinking about talking about was about just like really these goals that also feminists have worked towards recognition of harm within the criminal legal system. And I think, Dahlia, when you started talking about scarcity, to me, I'm like, yes, and the underlying emotion behind scarcity is often fear. And I think, what if it is that, oh, like, feminists have worked so hard towards sexual violence, intimate partner violence, all forms of gender-based violence being taken seriously by the criminal legal system, work so hard towards that. And now I think the fear is probably twofold. One is, what if that was not the right thing to do because it actually didn't get us like it didn't meet the needs and the goals that we had. And also, I think, and this kind of what Dahlia you named to kind of frame this conversation, which is what if that all of this and even trying alternative approaches would get us in a place where these things are not taken seriously, right? And I think kind of one of our main questions that we're trying to explore is like, how do we hold and balance these things, which is like to really be visionary and to yeah, to like pursue these alternative approaches like RJ and TJ with rigor without or rather balance that with still making sure that sexual violence is recognize for the harm it is and taken seriously. So I think we're already kind of starting to talk about that, but I just want to ask you as to how do you balance that in yourself and in your work?
Well, I'd love to start us off with that one. Um, I've been thinking a lot about anger these days. Anger is often going with fear as well. And I think that anger is a feeling that gets a really bad rap. And I think it's something that feminists are really good at. So it's, to me, anger is the opposite of scarcity. I don't know if y'all have ever tried to like put a scarcity container around your anger, because like that's a real good way to let it get bigger, right? And so, when I think about, folks who I've talked to who have survived sexual violence, they're angry and they should be angry because anger tells us what we need and what we deserve. Anger is this beautiful emotion that says, we're not going to put a scarcity container around the solution that I deserve. We're not going to put a scarcity container around like what's possible in this world to shift. My anger is aligning me with what should be. I think, like I said, feminists do a really good job of holding anger. And so when I think about, what part of that kind of carceral approach feminists have been asking the criminal justice system for, I don't want to throw the baby with the bathwater. I want to hang on to the anger there. I want to redirect it a little bit. And I think, over here in RJ worlds, we're moving along. I think we're starting to do a better job of this. And we kind of have this residual piece of anger hasn't always. There's been a push towards things like forgiveness. I think JJ, you spoke to this a little bit, like where it overlaps with kind of religious culture. There's this sense of like, we're all going to forgive and we're going to hold hands and everyone's going to get along at the end of the day. I think that's where feminism can do a good job of challenging RJ, TJ approaches to like, let's hold on to the anger. Let's let anger like tell us something important. So I think, as an RJ practitioner, my job is not to tell people not to be angry or to try to squash that anger. My job is to create a safe container. Anger can't be driving bus as far as how a process is going to go because it needs it needs fairness, it needs structure. And so my job as a facilitator is to bring that structure, and to kind of hold the container with the intention, not that the survivor I'm working with is not going to be allowed to be angry, but like we're actually going to allow for more anger because they don't have to be fair. I'm going to be fair. They don't have to be have this wider vision of the full humanity. This person who's just harmed them, I'm going to. And so, we're talking about feminism and the feeling of scarcity in criminal justice. I think we need to let a little bit of room in for that fear, because I think there's something real behind it. I think feminism has a lot to be just
I almost thought while you were talking, should have asked that question last. I feel like that is the note that we should end on. Let's just leave on anger. It's also my favorite place to leave things on. But I think I just want to maybe bring us back a little bit just to talk about this idea of, restorative justice and transformative justice often being understood or talked about as like more humane or better options. And yet, like we know that they can also reproduce harm if not practiced intentionally and thoughtfully. And I'm curious to hear from you about, yeah, what are some like also the unintended consequences that you've seen in how these again, not to kind of conflate them as the same thing, but for each, for restorative justice, what are some unintended consequences you've seen? And for transformative justice, and kind of what do you think that they can kind of offer each other from those unintended consequences?
I can start with something that it kind of brings up for me, even just a small piece of it, is like there's something about like really established and clear long-term modes of responding to something, if it's like the criminal legal system with crime or like the HR department in a workplace. Like there are certain systems that are invested with a type of authority that is, top down, that is oftentimes rooted in harmful systems, and just, the criminal legal system and like colonialism, HR, and like some of the ways that traditional workplaces have been set up to not be inclusive to all types of people. And I've seen in a lot of spaces that like we might be in like really good, solid critiques of these kinds of systems and the harms they perpetrate. But they also, I think I have seen, give a clarity and a even just that, like a clarity and a clearness of like, well, this is what it is, this is how it's going to happen, this is who's in charge, and this is who is the arbitrator of right and wrong. That when you move into something like TJ or RJ, what will you sacrifice that clarity in a kind of sometimes aspirational, visionary desire for something that's more holistic, that's more true, that's more meeting of the needs, that's more complicated and nuanced. Because, and then when you put it into community, it's like everybody has a voice, and no one's going to be the arbitrator of like, there's one right and one wrong, and someone's going to get punished and someone's going to get to walk away free, and one person has to suffer and the other person gets to be vindicated. Like you sacrifice that kind of clarity that sometimes speaks to like our base needs, like that desire for punishment or for just vindication, that we want to nuance that in the RJ and TJ spaces, but that also it's like there's a possibility for high reward in the transformative nature of it, but it's also really, really high risk, because it is inviting people into something that's not always clear. And I've seen in certain instances that sometimes the most marginalized people actually grab for those systems that are, set colonial, top down, arbitrating systems, because in spaces of like fear and uncertainty and vulnerability, there's at least a strength and a clarity in that of like, well, at least this is clear and it won't screw me over, or at least if it screws me over, I'll know exactly how and why. Whereas like stepping into something that's a little bit more spacious or visionary, um, people can get really, really hurt there if those processes aren't held with so much care. And even in the best and like best intentions, things can go wrong in a way that is like confusing and uncertain. And then there's no one to point to that's like, well, who's going to tell me who's right and who's wrong? Like, who's going to make sense of this? Um, yeah, so that's kind of what came up for me around like unintended consequences. And like sometimes our most visionary things are also things that like create actually a lot of risk for people who are already marginalized or vulnerable, even though I think they also can create the highest reward.
I really appreciate this question, like getting to dig into it. I think that there's, for me, they're like, again, like very distinct. So maybe like, it sounds like we're kind of talking about like TJ first, and maybe we could like circle back to RJ, because I do feel like the ways I've seen RJ really cause harm and go off the rails are very, it's like, yeah, kind of JJ, what you were already starting to articulate. It's like very different than TJ processes in community because the structures are so different, right? And I think that causes it. So for me with TJ, um, I've seen, like I mentioned this yesterday, the other talk, but it's like the Freedom Community Center that's in St. Louis in the States. I think the states, the so-called states, have done a really great job of having sometimes quote unquote RJ orgs that are definitely TJ and abolitionist projects that have like started to really carve out some beautiful work that are kind of existing in this gray area, like Chat Project, right? Like they specifically look at interpersonal violence, sexual harm in the Bay Area. A lot of their work is translated into not just English, which is like a really important first step. Like it's sad that that's a bar that's very rarely met, and translation is like often not even like a line budget item in RJ processes. Like I've seen that over and over again, the harm that that can do, and the yeah. So anyway, I'm going into all the harm of RJ, but with TJ, I think for me, specifically, I think that it's about capacity. We've built up a lexicon, we built up a language, and a lot of a performance, I think, sadly, or maybe it's aspirational in the best light, and I think performative on its worst day, depending on like where they're going out of the house, um, of what we want to be, right? Like we want to be abolitionists. And I'll share a little bit, right? Like I think the people, like I was causing harm, serious, concrete, egregious harm, absolutely had to stop. The way that people responded showed me that they were so deeply um, carceral, right? And so deeply terrified of, didn't believe in change, right? Like some of the languaging was like, this is ongoing, this is repetitive. It was, absolutely. Like, but that's seen as an inability rather than a lack of resource or support. And pretty much everyone I've ever worked with in an RJ process is very rare, unless I'm working with a young person, that that's the first harm that they've caused, even if that's the first criminal charge that they've gotten. Like that's just not generally how we get to um, causing sexual violence or repeated IPV, right? We know that, and often if someone's on an IPV charge, I'm going to assume that there's not a deep understanding of consent. And I don't see those things as often separate because they rarely are. Um, so I think for me, on a TJ level, we just don't have the capacity built up. I think, again, Resma Manikim's concept of like reps, like we don't have the ability. I heard someone that was hired to do like facilitate my process. What this person said was like, I've never forgiven the people that have harmed me. And I was like, okay, I'm going to find a different facilitator because you don't seem like you should be doing this. But that wasn't flags at the time. And granted, this is many years ago, but I see community not really being ready yet to have done the underlying work. And my friend Shannon Prose Darby talks about this all the time. Like accountability is something we have to practice on much lower levels before we as community members can like intervene successfully on like complicate, like someone like me with who was houseless, experienced a ton of harm and is a survivor of CSA and all of these other horrible things, systemic and narrative, intervene on like a complex case of trauma as it manifests in adult and their interpersonal relationships. Like that wasn't a like community ready response. There wasn't people around me that had the skills or tools or training to intervene um, and really hold that kind of harm. And I think we're not really, because we want to be abolitionists, we want that to be the case. But I think that we really need to build out, like, are we ready to work with people who are causing this kind of harm? And then maybe it's a question of like, what do we need to put into place? Because again, when it goes badly, it can cause a lot of harm. So I'll stop there, but I definitely want to circle back to RJ because I have a lot to say about those unintended consequences.
Yeah, thanks everyone. I'm thinking about, I don't think it's any coincidence that TJ and abolition is often kind of housed in communities that experience the most scarcity, the most precarity. Like you said, JJ, it's very high risk to be having folks who are generally like I often think about, TJ processes I've seen where everyone involved has the best of intentions and a beautiful vision, and everyone's got two jobs because we're people who live in poverty and we got to hustle to make rent. And so some of the unintended consequences and harm that can happen. It hurts a lot more to be harmed by your own community. Like if I were to go to cops tomorrow to report a crime, I would probably expect to be harmed by them. And when it happened, it probably wouldn't hurt that bad because of what I'm expecting. If it came from my best friend, that would hurt a lot more. It would definitely cause more. And then, we see how this harm can beget more harm. And now there's these ripple effects of all this harm. And I think another thing that happens, I appreciated you mentioning kind of the performance of TJ, Tyler. And I think, we can fall into this habit of pedestalizing people in communities because we really want, this came up when we did all the work around queer and trans communities at Salal quite a lot. We really want to believe that our communities are going to be these safe places. Finally, I found my people. Finally, I found this community that I'm going to step into and that's going to hold me and see me, and I'm finally going to be safe there. Unfortunately, that's not the reality. And so I can see it playing out with EJ and responses to harm quite a bit, where we pedestalize folks who, kind of take up that work. Same way that I often joke about the trans person to counselor pipeline. How when we experience a lot of harm in our lives, we then want to go on and JJ's laughing at me because I'm not trying to call you out, JJ. This is not about you. I think there's people who experience a lot of harm in their lives, then want to go on and help, and we're not always equipped to do that. I think a lot of the times we come into the social workers are the same. RJ practitioners can be the same. We come into these positions of wanting to undo harm because we've experienced a lot of it, and we're not always resourced enough to do it. And then along comes this community that says, oh my God, finally someone is doing the thing. Someone is going to give me an alternative, a better option for harm. And it's a recipe for disaster because, of course, like that person is not more resourced than anybody else. A lot of the time, I think we're in this work because we're less resourced than the average Joe. And then harm happens because. So I really like this kind of framing of locating that harm outside of ourselves, locating it in systems. One of my big fears, and again, this goes back to the queer and trans work at Salal. One of the big fears that I always have is I don't want to be shining a light on this community as like, oh, look at this community is so damaged. There's so much harm happening in it. Let's zoom out even further and look at how like these broader structures, homophobia, transphobia, racism, colonization, how are those systems setting us up to have harm within our communities? And how is that harm within our communities setting us up to have interpersonal harm? So I think JJ, you said it perfectly. It's high risk, high reward work. And I think it's important that we be.
Yeah, I think you said it so beautifully, Felix, in the sense of like how I understand that is that those like harm at home is an extension of state violence, right? And so if we see that trajectory, then we can start to actually address it. But how do we build up that capacity? And I think kind of maybe circling back to answer it from RJ, I think also, I mean, to me, some of the most unintended consequences start with kind of like the Howard Zier school of RJ, which was like benevolence, white benevolence, which is like really dangerous. Saviorism, really dangerous concepts. Helping, I've heard a lot of this in RJ of like the second chance mentality, seeing things as individual choices where we obviously have individual responsibility. But seeing it as like a return, right? A restoration, going back. I would say I was really shocked moving here from the States because most RJ orgs here are white. There are very few people with lived experience that work or have positions of power. It's an incredibly white field. It's often deeply connected to academia here, which I think also can be like complicated. And I think, again, when we have like this concept of like a group of people who don't have the same kinds of lived experience or interactions with systems coming in to help other people, like the org I work for, has one of the most robust training programs, Restorative Justice Victoria. And when I went through it, like the word intersectionality or colonization or racism wasn't mentioned once. And it's like 40 plus hours of in-person training. And it really focuses on a lot of concepts that I think came out of this Howard Zier school of thought of like motivational interviewing and like, which is fine, it's great. But I think we look at, again, like harm on these individual levels, it can be so deeply damaging, and that we fail to really address what the government has called here, which I actually think is a helpful term, is like power-based harms, right? Like harms that are based in a power differential, such as sexualized violence or any kind of interpersonalized violence, or hate-based harms. And I think that having like being ready to respond to these kinds of harms takes an incredible amount of infrastructure, an incredibly long time, where it's like talking to someone, and he's an amazing scholar, and he was like, and I was telling him some of the files and clients I've worked with, and he was like, yeah, I wouldn't know what to do meeting with someone every week for 2 years to talk about sexual violence. Like, what does that actually tangibly every day on the ground look like to move someone from having caused sexual violence to becoming reliably safe, and understanding why they made the decision they did, what they would have needed at the time to make a different decision, um, and then how to maintain that. And that, even 2 years is, in my opinion, not long enough to really work with someone for these like complex harms. So I think RJ is actually at the position of causing a lot of harm in the ways in which it can, again, pair people like that have very disparate experiences with each other, from, again, that kind of like savior benevolent mentality of here to help you make different choices in your life moving forward.
Thank you. I just have to say I love how much the three of you are like beautifully put. I exactly what you said. Just like the referencing of what each other is saying. I really appreciate that. I think actually what Tyler, where you were getting into feels like a really good segue to talk about like what are then conditions that are necessary for non-carceral approaches to be successful. And of course, we plenty of times find ourselves in situations where those conditions aren't available. So how do we navigate that? But I think kind of first and foremost, like, yeah, what would you say are conditions that are necessary for these approaches to work? Yeah.
I mean, I'll start us by just saying like something that Tyler just said is just even that basic of like believing that people can change, I think is like very like you don't know that it's not there until you start looking at it. You see the things that people say about people who have caused harms, or well, we talk about the system, and it is based on this idea of just like if you do something bad, you're a bad person and you're dangerous, and we shouldn't be associated with you. We shouldn't get close to you because you've done what you did and you're done for. But if we don't believe that people can change, and this goes back to like feminism, the anti-violence movement, it's like if we don't believe that people can change and grow out of the systems of harm that we've inherited, like truly what are we doing? And this is why, like, sorry, I won't take us too far off, we'll get back, but like, after how many years of the feminist push for criminal law reform around sexual violence, like the rates of sexual violence have not gone down. Yeah, which is a whole other thing. But that was the one thing that like there's so many other things, and I want to hear what y'all have to say about what needs to be in place. But that felt like a big one to come emphasize.
I think one of the big challenges that I see in community-based responses, I sort of alluded to this earlier, they take so much work and so much dedication. So a big red flag to me is when I see folks saying, yeah, sure, I've got 3 jobs and I'm, kids and all that, but I'll show up to meetings once a week for an indeterminate amount of time. Like, I think we need to be real about what we're signing up for, because so much harm can happen when we overpromise, and then that can have more impacts down the line. And the other thing that I see happen sometimes is, knowing that it's such a high investment, who is being invested in? I've seen people come out of the woodwork to hold up this beautiful nuanced process for someone who holds a lot of social capital. For our local, I don't know, if this is not a real example, I'm just making one up, but our local party organizer, someone who throws really good parties that everyone wants to go to, pretty likely that's who's going to be invested in. What about the folks who don't have that social capital? So all these kind of harms of like where resources and attention go, they don't disappear the moment that it's a community-based response. So, and I think maybe the last thing I'll mention, and I see this in RJ world, I see it in TJ world, the ability for us to like self-reflect on our own stuff. We see a lot of folks kind of, I think Tyler, you named it as the saviorism mentality. Let me kind of parachute in and tell you how to live and how to make better choices. And if any of us are sitting there thinking I've never caused harm, you probably not. You probably have. I think all of us do at some point or another. So a green flag that I'm always looking for is like, is this somebody who wants to hold the process, or maybe wants to kind of, we talked a little bit about pedestalizing TJ. Is this somebody who can like reflect honestly on the harm that they've caused? Am I able to like maybe speak from experience? Am I able to really internalize the values that we're talking about in RJ, rather than just the you should? I think, to some of your points around RJ, Tyler, I often ask, what are we restoring? Are we restoring power imbalances because we want to just sweep things under the rug? Are we restoring relationships that led to the harm in the first place? Or are we restoring like our internal sense of justice and rightness in the world, which of course is like a much bigger.
I love that. I think that's really aptly put. I think I think I'm kind of hearing the question right of like, what are the things that need to be present for accountability to be possible, whether that's like through a TJ or an RJ lens. And I think for me, maybe this is an autistic thing, but it's like I get really, as an abolitionist who has existed in a lot of community spaces, deeply believes in TJ and has worked and gotten paychecks from RJ and worked in diversion programs for a long time and with systems partners because our people are still in those systems. And I deeply believe that, that's important. I think what that speaks to is an ability to hold and tolerate contradiction, right? Like that's a fundamental need in any of these processes, is how do you sit without reverting to a binary and allow what is in like a Jungian way, like a transcendent third thing to emerge. I think Kai Cheng Tum does a really beautiful job of talking through a lot of like tools and processes for us to understand like really like get honest around like what is our capacity and strength. Like she has a lot of really beautiful graphics around like, am I the right person for this process? Should I be involved in this process? Am I activated right now? Do I have something to offer? What's drawing me in? Is what's drawing me in kind of white supremacist urgency? Or is this coming from a place of like genuinely having something to offer? I think, in my experience in both of these realms of justice that is not carceral, whether that's RJ or TJ, JJ, you were talking about this too. I deeply believe in a structure and a process. I think, again, like insight, creative interventions, right? The toolkit that Mimi Kim and others put out is like a great starting point. And I think the fact that there's very little out there, Miriam Kaba and Shir Hassan fumbling towards repair, that workbook is good, but there's very few resources. And right, like the seminal text of Bell Hooks, The Will to Change, like, but if you really grab at this, we haven't put it down yet. And so I'm curious, like, right, to me, the next step is like, what are the ways that we can, and I even am mapping this out currently right now, right, is like, how do we really define and outline for people, like what, because I have this with clients all the time, like, how do I know if I'm doing in a process, how do I know if I'm on the right track? Like what's successful? What are the benchmarks so that I can feel like I'm moving towards accountability? How do we specifically define accountability? What are some of the realms you pass through in order to be accountable? So for me, and I think that we, again, lack those structures. I think some of them is like, and Philly's Pissed and Philly Stands Up was a project in Philadelphia in the so-called States that was beautiful. One worked with survivors, one worked with people that caused harm. TJ Project, deeply rooted in community. First step they had asked, they did some work with me, and I'm forever grateful for those folks, is like, do you have housing? Right? First question, like, you need stable housing in order to engage in any kind of process. Do you have food? Right? Like RJ programs will ask that, but then like I was charged with the crown to work with a client who's amazing. He's incredible, queer man. It was an IPV charge, one of my favorite people in the world, did an RJ process with me for over a year and a half from his car while living in his car. That is a condition that to me does not support accountability. And I think that's again what's kind of deeply flawed with RJ is like we function in a silo, at least my organization. We're not deeply connected to housing organizations or community health centers or mental health resources or substance abuse counseling. And if we're not deeply invested in first and foremost connecting people to that, then accountability is not really possible, I believe, and not in any sustainable way. Because I would like to see how we all respond to interpersonal conflict when we're living in our car and struggling with like substance use problems, right? Like, even if we're not doing things in that level, our skills are going to go down. So I think that, yeah, to me, those are some of the conditions, and that we have to be community specific. Like back home in Wabanaki territory in the Donland, I was working with like specific organizations like New England Arab American Association to help them understand some RJ processes specifically for youth and understand the public school system so that they could go and represent their youth, because youth that are coming from Afghanistan, Iraq, Lebanon are going to have a totally different concept of family, harm, accountability, and the processes that are going to support those youth are very different than white youth in Maine. And so I think, again, these processes need to be very culturally specific. And I think, again, I think of them, this is a little woo, but I think it's safe here, is like they're spiritual. And it's about a reconnection for me to ritual and to ceremony and to witnessing and to community. And when we professionalize that out of it, I think that we really don't tend to the whole of the people we're supporting, because harming people harms our spirits, harms that intimacy, harms their sense of trust. I think this work has to do with grief work. And really also, I've never seen an RJ program really look at this. Growing a New Heart taught me this. They also run a call to change hotline. But we have to, and I think we should change our evaluation systems to this, is to do values evaluation when people come in, like what are your values? And then when people leave a process, recheck in about values, because a lot of our harm is connected to abusive values. And how do we identify what those values and co-belief systems are to work with people to make sure that A, they're in alignment with their values, or B, work on values that need to shift for them to be reliably safe and not cause harm.
Just, I have a selfish question I want to ask because it really very much touches on what Tyler just said. And I think this is something that, um, like I would say, like, I think just in many conversations I've had with, I think both Felix and JJ, where we struggle with like, what if also like scarcity mindset drives people in their assessment or like their desire for accountability? It's almost like everything we also want and need, it can be, maybe not everything, but a lot of things can be also informed by scarcity, that I think sometimes I've seen where it's like, oh, well, as a third party, it seems like this person is stepping into accountability, and yet the person who was harmed was just like, nope, 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 that's not accountability. And I think, Tyler, just like, I think when you started to talk about like kind of that through a process, sometimes people's values may change, right? But also that depending on what values they're coming into the process with, it may actually impact the process quite a bit. But I think when you have seen people are like, no, that's not accountability. No, that person has not stepped into accountability. Like, how have you worked with that? And do we just go with like, oh, as long as the person who has been harmed, if they don't think that the person who caused harm has been accountable, then the process just keeps going? This is my selfish question. That was not on the list of questions that we were supposed to talk about. And I know we're almost at time, but I'm very curious. What do you do with that?
Yeah, I'll go off book with you, son, man. I'll go there. This is another sort of I don't want to quite call it a fear, but like a flag that I have around alternative justice and sexual violence. You know, when we're kind of hinging our ideas of success on the person who caused harm, I worry that we're reproducing the conditions. So here is something, say I'm a survivor, something super egregious has happened. All I want in the world is for it to be set right. And we don't want to set that person up to be sitting here waiting for that to come from the other person. Because here's the thing about RJ, TJ, we're not kidding when we say that it's optional. If folks showing up to a process is like, it feels important to me and it's embedded in our systems, like they don't have to. And in the case of sexual violence, that is upheld in our culture. There's often a lot of cost associated with saying, yes, I did cause harm, and often not a lot of external mechanisms that are going to hold somebody accountable. It's really optional. And I think to be realistic, most of the time, people are not. We can offer them the pathway that feels important to me. And, a lot of the times we can open the door and they're not going to walk through it. And so we don't want to be setting this up for further harm by continuing to put the power in the hands of the person who just harmed them to now come. I think, Tyler, you said something really important about grief. And I agree with you that there is a lot of overlap with grief work. When someone has been harmed, when someone has experienced sexual violence, it can't be undone. All the accountability process in the world can't sexually assault somebody. And so there is a grief process that we have to go we can't change what happened. We can develop a different relationship to it. And grief work is something that is, I think, very important to me these days. And what I've learned from grief practitioners in my life is that, your life can get bigger around grief, but the grief is not. And so, I think it's important that we be realistic with folks when they're asking us for an alternative justice response. That it is entirely optional. The person might not walk through the door, and even if they do absolutely everything right, at the end of the day, you're still going to.
I mean, I love this conversation, and I'm like sad to hear that we're like near time, but hopefully it just means that we're like more conversations coming. I get asked this question a lot, especially when I'm checking in with in a process the person who's been harmed or the survivor, right? Like I remember working on that case that I mentioned where it was a historical childhood sexual assault, and the survivor was like, how do you know this person's not just faking it? And I think it's really important. Like I don't think you should be an RJ unless you're like, or TJ, if you're not, right? Like, again, this comes back to capacity and training. And I'm like, okay, here are the ways in which I understand this person to be accountable. Here are the tangible things, right? Where it's like, there has been a consistent over long periods of time shift in language, right? This person used to use language that was deeply, I thought, violent in the minimization, right? And the shifting of blame, constantly referencing facts that were inaccurate. That has stopped trying to say, I just want to move past it, right? Has started to hold the concept, like what you said, Felix, of, I know I can never take this back, right? So like starting to demonstrate a committed and over time shift in language, tolerating questions. Like in an RJ process, one of the things I think we have done well at Restorative Justice Victoria is, and I haven't seen a lot of other programs do this, it takes a lot of capacity, is that each person, the person who was harmed and the person who caused harm, gets assigned a mentor or someone who walks with them. And then later in the process, if there's going to be any form of dialogue, 2 new facilitators are introduced. And that's another point where those facilitators will ask the restorative conversations before 2 people are brought together. And what that does is it's 2 new people who doesn't have an attachment or relationship to the person who caused harm, asking these questions that are activating, right? And how does that person respond in activation? Whereas if you just have those 2 people, you don't have this kind of check and balance. You also, so I think that there are these tangible steps, again, where like RJ can kind of share some of the structure and the tools that have been created with TJ Spaces, which is one of the things I feel really passionate about. And then I think the reality too, where RJ just fails and TJ has more potential, is long-term connection to community. I think RJ programs though that are rooted in community, which again, most in Canada aren't in the same way. Like again, Freedom Community Center, they're doing like victim service funds, right? They are also concerned with housing, with advocacy, policy change work. Like they are people who have grown up there, whose parents have grown up there. It's rooted in community. It's a Black-led organization. I think TJ hopefully can be, not always, if you're actually doing it in community, which is why a lot of facilitators I know won't do processes outside of where they live, because they're like, you need those relationships to kind of invest you to stay in it for the long term, right? To make sure that this is like a long-term shift. And I think the heretical thought that no one wants to talk about is every person I've worked with, including myself, didn't just stop causing harm. We learned slowly how to get better, which meant I was continuously causing harm for a long period of time and learning how to do it better as I integrated the skills and tools I needed to stop causing violence in my personal relationships. I did not just stop because it wasn't, I did have some abusive values that I had to unlearn, but largely it was that I was out of control. It was a regulation thing, and that I was out of alignment with my values. So it was like, how do I get the tools to stay in alignment with my values, to tolerate dysregulation so that I don't cause situational violence, right? Where power, control, and coercion really talk to that you're having these abusive values of thinking that someone is an object that is merged with you and that you have a right to own. That wasn't the construct that I was talking about. And I think again, the nuance and the skills for people to start to understand, because if we don't name the harm, you can't heal it. And so if we treat everything like the worst case scenario, which is kind of what happened to me, you miss the plot. And it's not about even about the person. It's really like me in that case. It's really about that you can't fix it if you're not diagnosing. It's like a car. It's like if we're constantly just fixing the brakes, but it's actually, I don't know, clearly I don't know cars. I'm like an ignition problem or the muffler, the gay person being sports or cars. And it's like, shh. But you know what I mean? Like a different part of the car. This is the point. And I think that that's the thing, is like, because we're so afraid of this. And again, not to just talk about insurgent love, but she talks about this thing, this quote, where the feminist argument has gotten us off the plot. I'm paraphrasing, the dangerous few, because it's actually the many and the multiple. And we really need to get specific though about what, because I was causing dysregulated situational violence versus power and control and coercion. It's not a values difference. I'm not saying I'm better, but like you can't fix it. And I think that that's really, again, this condition that we need to make sure that someone's accountable. You have to understand what they actually need to be accountable to, right? Really naming the harm and all the dynamics and the values that go along with it, versus just like a criminal charge, right? Of like assault. That's rarely what we actually treat in RJ is, battery or assault with a weapon. It's not really about that. For me, when I've worked with a client with that charge, it was like, what was it to be a youth in care and to have experienced and witnessed so much violence that then you internalize that, right? The assault with a weapon charge was the background.
Really waiting to see if you were gonna land that car analogy, Tyler. I was gonna be like, I see Tyler is that kind of queer. If you landed that, but before I hand it over to Talia, I just wanted to see JJ if there's anything you want to say before we wrap. Yeah, and then I'll hand over to Talia. Yeah.
I mean, a million things. Y'all are like so brilliant. I think maybe one thing I would just end with is something, again, like Tyler, when you said like watching someone get to the place of saying, I can never take that back. It just really reminded me of like how hard it is for so many people to actually sit with the harm that they've caused. And like the amount of like love and help and self-worth and like inner work that needs to happen for, I think, most people to be able to admit that they have hurt someone in a way that can never be taken back. It's just like it's one of those like it's one of those really, really difficult things in this work is like if someone is in shame and they can't accept what they've done because if they were to admit that they did this terrible thing, like their entire self-concept would fall apart. Like that's where you get people coming with complete defensiveness. And I think that's why these processes to really have someone transform can take years and years and years and like so much support. Yeah. So there's like so many more things to say. Yeah, that was just one thing that stuck out to me.
Yeah, I just keep thinking about attachment, and just how so many of the systems that we live within do everything every day to create disconnection and from ourselves, from our bodies, from the food we're eating, from the ways we're moving with each other, that really it feels like a reattachment project, all of this, right? And the discernment about when the conditions might be right is really about like understanding whether attachment is possible and how we move through that. And yeah, I'm so glad I'm attached to all of you. Y'all are brilliant. And I'm really grateful that you were willing to have this like, yeah, very vulnerable conversation and very truthful conversation. I think it's important that we practice those pieces as well as we're on this journey together. So this conversation could have gone on for many more hours, but it's likely that nobody would ever watch it. So I'm grateful for those who have stuck it out. I want to say thank you to the Department of Justice for supporting this Victims of Crime Week series. And also to all of you for being willing to be here today with us at Salal. And with that, I wish you all a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thank y'all.
Everyone. It's been really special.